Good evening, everybody. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to our first presentation of Forum of the 2010 program year. I hope that despite the chilly weather, you have had a chance to enjoy the beautiful fall foliage. Korea is famous for its fiery reds and golden yellows this time of the year. I think all the ETAs must have enjoyed your fall very much because most of you are in the provincial area, country area. Right? Tonight we gather for a presentation by 2000 junior research Inga Diederich, who received a bachelor's degree in art history from the University of Chicago and who is currently affiliated with Seoul National University. Her presentation tonight will focus on the work of Hyun-jik, a 20th-century monk who provides fascinating perspective on various Buddhist texts and modern Korean history through English language translation. I am anxious to see the outcome of Ms. Diederich's research and hope that her presentation sparks an interesting conversation about modern translations and their impact on historical perspective. Before we begin, I would also like to remind all of you, our guests, that there will be a reception, as you know, immediately following tonight's presentation on the third floor. Our staff has prepared some seasonal treat for you to enjoy, and I hope that you will join us as we gather together and continue our discussion of Ms. Diederich's intriguing topic. And after her presentation, we will have Q&A session. If the Q&A session is going to last really long, I would like to monitor it, to stop it. And while you are having the meal, the reception, you can just continue discussion with Inga. So let's welcome Inga.
Thank you, Mrs. Shim. As Mrs. Shim told you all, I've been working for the past year on a translation of this book, the Sanjung-ilji, or Mountain Diary, by a monk named Hyun-jik during the 20th century in Korea. Before I get into the translation, though, I know history of Buddhism in Korea is a little vague for most people. It was pretty vague for me when I first got here, so I'm going to start with a quick introduction to the entire history of Buddhism. So if anyone nods off, I'll just yell or something when I get to the good stuff to wake you up. Okay, so Buddhism was introduced to Korea through China. It came to China from India, obviously. In China, it went through a domestication process that was a little awkward in the early stages. People didn't really know how to deal with Buddhism at first, and there were freestanding traditions of both Taoism and Confucianism. So Taoism came into play in as far as when Chinese people came across concepts that they didn't really understand how to translate into Chinese, they would just use Taoist concepts. And sometimes that worked and sometimes it didn't. And Confucianism came into play mostly as an opposition force to Buddhism. Confucians really didn't like Buddhism. So Buddhism came to China officially around 58 or 75 AD. It's usually dated to the reign of Emperor Ming of the Han Dynasty. But there's new evidence that it was probably there as early as the 1st century BC. As far as Korea goes, there's also an official history, but it probably came a little earlier. The official history for each of the three kingdoms is in Goguryeo. It came during the second year of King Seosurim's reign. That was 372 CE. via the monk Sundo, who came from the Emperor Qin, I believe, sent him with a bunch of emissaries with Buddhist texts and artifacts and all the like. Baekje came in the first year of King Chingyu's reign, that was 384 CE, through the barbarian monk, that's what he's called, Malananda, who came from the Jin in China. Silla is probably the most interesting history. It came to Silla pretty early, through Koguryo probably. During the reign of King Nulchi, a monk named Hukoja, the black-bearded monk, came to Silla from Koguryo and stayed in the House of Morye. House of Morye continued to shelter Buddhist monks, including the very famous Buddhist monk Ado. But it wasn't officially adopted by the Silla kingdom until the 15th year of the reign of King Popong. King Popong wanted to embrace Buddhism as the official religion of the Silla dynasty or the Silla kingdom, except his officials really weren't into it. So he got this courtier named Itadon to agree to martyr himself for the cause of Buddhism. So Itadon went out and started to build a Buddhist temple within the Silla kingdom. The officials got pissed off and they had him executed, and according to the story, when he was executed, instead of blood coming out of his neck, a bunch of pure white spiritual something just gushed out instead. And the people were so impressed by this miracle that Silla became the first kingdom to embrace Buddhism as its official religious doctrine. Despite this, within Korea there were still issues with the pre-standing Confucian doctrine. And that pretty much lasted, that's still going on. It lasted throughout Korean history. The key issues at the time of Buddhism's introduction were basically the lack of filial piety, that since your body is given by your ancestors, it should be returned to them intact. So things like Buddhists shaving their head, that was an affront to your ancestors. Or in China especially, it transmitted a little bit to Korea, but not quite as much as in China. In China, especially during Buddhist ordinations, people would burn themselves in some way or another, disfigure themselves. So I think there was, after shaving your head, you put these wax strings, like lamp strings, on your head in a crisscross pattern, set them on fire, and just let them burn down. So that was supposed to show like patience or something. Or on the arm, or you hear about people making candles out of their fingers. So that didn't go over too well with the Confucian Koreans. There were also issues with the translation of key concepts that took hundreds of years to kind of suss out properly. And the indestructibility of the soul, that's kind of a central tenet of Confucian philosophy, clashed with the central idea of anatman, or non-soul, in Buddhism. Lastly, the universality of enlightenment was a big issue, with Confucians kind of confused by the idea that everybody had the potential to be enlightened. That doesn't make sense in a hierarchical structure. Okay, so after this acceptance, you've got a flourishing period that starts with the Three Kingdoms era Silla, kind of mounts in unified Silla and reaches its high point in Koryo Kingdom. So the representative figures you get during this flourishing period are Bisang, who's a monk in the Three Kingdom Silla period, and he was particularly affiliated with Hwaum Buddhism. Hwaum Buddhism was probably the most influential school of Buddhism during the Silla period. It was, does anyone know what the Hwarang are? So the Hwarang were like this, kind of the equivalent of like knights, I guess, during the Silla period, and they were very strongly affiliated with Hwaum Buddhism. Then you've got Wonchok, and he was famous for the Yogacara school, or consciousness only. It's a little strange that he was so influential in Korea because he left Korea at age 15, lived in China, and never came back. somehow his ideas continue to be transmitted though. Wonhyo is probably the most famous monk from the Three Kingdoms Silla period. He's officially affiliated with the Hedong school. The only strange thing about that is he's also the only member of the Hedong school. He's called the reconciler of differences, or the great syncretist sometimes, because he tended to pull from every available Buddhist school at the time. You have to remember that at this time, within India, China, Korea, Japan, there were many, many different schools of Buddhism based on different sutras for the most part. They tend to be doctrinally based disciplines. And he would just kind of grab from whichever one he wanted. And he's also the model for what they call the crazy monk. So not only would he pull from every school, but he also disregarded every school as the mood hit him. So he liked to drink, he liked to get into fights, he seduced a princess and had an illegitimate child by her. He was a pretty awesome guy all around. Then after Three Kingdoms period Silla, we get into Tong Silla and then Koryo. And probably the most influential monk in Korean history actually came from this period. His name is Chinul, and he lived from 1158 to 1210. He was the first really famous Sun monk of note, and introducing Sun is really important to Korean Buddhism. It's known in China as Chan Buddhism. It's really famous in Japan as Zen Buddhism. We've all heard about that. But it became the Buddhist discipline in Korea. It's probably the only country in East Asia where it had such a stranglehold on religious followers, and it really started to get promotion through Chinul. So distinction between Sun and all the disciplines like Hwaum that we've seen to this point is previous disciplines tended to be based on sutras. So it was you study, you get enlightened. Sun Buddhism is you sit and you think, and you think, and you think, and you think, and then you get enlightened. So Chinul was the big proponent of this, and he wrote tons and tons of treatises persuading everybody that Sun was a proper way to enlightenment. Ironically, he himself was probably more doctrinally inclined than he would like to admit. He founded his own retreat society with like-minded monks in 1190. Songwangsa is a very famous temple that he founded. And he spent the last 10 years of his life training hundreds and hundreds of monks and attracting the attention and support of military leaders and the court, who continued to support Sun in its rise. Okay, I'm still on this slide. Okay, so, intersection of church and state during the late Three Kingdoms and Unified Silla period, when Buddhism was really being embraced. This model of the ideal Buddhist king that was developed in India, the Chakravartin king, became a model for all Silla rulers to follow. So probably the first was the King Popong, the first king to embrace Buddhism, who followed the Indian King Ashoka's model and retired at the end of his reign to live as a monk. And then continuing with King Chinun, who named both of his sons, one was named Tongmyon and the second was Kumyon, for copper and gold wheel, which is the third and first class Chakravartin rulers. And he erected all these Buddhist monuments to mark his conquered territory, also like Ashoka. And then probably that Chakravartin model of kingship culminates with King Chinpyong, 570 to 632 CE, who renamed himself Suddhana and renamed his wife Maya after the Buddha's parents. Unfortunately, they didn't have a son, so the Buddha never made it out of that line. And then you've got, there we go, the transition from Silla to the Koryo period, which, like I said, is marked by this shift from doctrinally based schools to the meditation-based Son Buddhism. Late Silla kings saw this shift happening and saw what a threat to their power it could be. So they attempted to patronize Sun schools to maintain order as their kingdom was kind of falling apart around them. Unfortunately, the techniques that they used were not successful in their time, but they were appropriated by the following Koryo kingdom. Within Koryo, the kind of semblance of a separation between church and state that had been maintained during the Silla period went to hell completely. They're tied together intimately, and Buddhist figures rose to positions of civil power. People who were originally in positions of civil power called on the religious authority of the Buddhist church indiscriminately. It's a system that's been called state protectionism by scholars. Monasteries became centers of economic and cultural influence. They're engaged in all kinds of financial activity, loans. They acted as landlords, hospices, schools. They also owned more slaves than the royal court did. Okay, so in late Koryo, you get the Mongol invasions of 1231 to 1259, and the effect of that is it's bad. It's bad for the Koryo kingdom, period. Palaces get burned down, monasteries get burned down, the royal family has to relocate, and when they're finally returned to power, it's as a broken dynasty. They have to intermarry with Mongol princesses. They're constantly watched by Mongol overlords. This works out very well for Buddhism, however, because the Mongols are sympathetic to Buddhism. So the Mongol overseers raise these Buddhist monks to positions of high secular authority. This figure I mentioned here, Shinton, who died in 1371, he's probably the most infamous example of this. He was named a special minister by the king at the time, under duress from the Mongolians. And eventually people just got so pissed off at him using his power here and there that they ended up killing him. But he became this rallying point for anyone who had an issue with Buddhism to say, you know, this guy sucked, and Buddhism sucks, generally. Okay, so also during this time, thanks to the Pax Mongolica, you've got a new influx of ideas to Korea. In particular, Neo-Confucian ideas in China. This Neo-Confucianism was a synthesis created by the Chinese scholar Zhu Xi, 1130 to 1200, that incorporated cosmology and metaphysical speculation about man and his relation to the cosmos, and more than anything, this Neo-Confucianism in China was a reaction to their form of Sun Buddhism, Chan Buddhism. So he had a lot of issues with that, and all those issues were transmitted to Korean scholars who were feeling a lot of the same problems at the time. So the stock charges that Neo-Confucians in Zhu Xi's party, I guess, had against Buddhism was that the autonomous monastic institutions undermined the political authority and economic basis of the state, that monastic life was fundamentally unproductive, that it was a foreign creed, so from India, inferior to domestic Chinese traditions, that it was morally corrupt because it did not uphold social values. Again, that's related to the like cutting of hair and not having children and all that kind of stuff. And it incited people to squander their possessions in the hope of attaining good karma or avoiding hell and gaining paradise. So these Neo-Confucian scholars ended up allying themselves with the next kingdom to take over in Korea, that would be Joseon. So first of all, they had a strong alliance with the first Joseon king, Yi Seong-gye. Unfortunately, it was a political alliance on his part. He was himself a pretty devout Buddhist, but he couldn't take power without the support of the Neo-Confucians. So during his time, reforms were not so drastic. However, from his son's time on, suppression of Buddhism gained momentum fast, and so the Chosun dynasty is known still as the period of greatest oppression for Korean Buddhists, and a lot of them are still pretty bitter about it, even though I don't think any of them were living then. So the big architect of this oppression was named Cheong Do-jeon, 1337 to 98. He was among the principal architects of the Chosun dynasty. He was adamantly opposed to Buddhism. He was just a Neo-Confucian scholar, but he had a lot of power. He composed the first systematic treatise during this time to renounce the fundamentals of Buddhism as heterodox. So going on from him, you've got 1405 to 1406, the 11 existing schools, by this I mean like the doctrinal schools of Buddhism within Korea, were forcefully reduced to 7, and the number of temples that were allowed to exist was reduced to 242. In 1423, these 7 schools were further reduced to 2 schools, Sun and Kyo Buddhism. Eventually, Kyo kind of petered out, and so you ended up with Sun as the single Buddhist school still active in Korea, and that's still the case today. Whereas, in China you still have various doctrinal schools, Japan you have various schools, Korea is only Sun Buddhism. And that reduction was carried out by King Sejong, who everyone's heard of for inventing Hangul. King Sejong also granted only 18 monasteries to each of these 2 schools, Sun and Kyo, and reduced the number of monks, slaves, and miscellaneous monastic workers overall to only 1,800. Then King Seongjong, 1468 to 94, banned virtually all Buddhist practices in cities and prohibited the founding of new monasteries or ordination of monks. Also in his time, the Yongsan-gun disestablished the 2 remaining monasteries in the capital, the respective headquarters of the Sun and Kyo schools, and abolished the monastic examination system. Despite this, during the Chosun period, you do have a continuing Buddhist practice. There's kind of a divide between the public direction that Chosun society was taking and the private devotions that people were carrying out within their own homes. In particular, women within the court and every other strata of society tended to be pretty devout Buddhists. Even the kings tended to, even if they were officially bashing on Buddhism, they would personally practice Buddhist devotions, or often there would be a switch late in life. I guess when they got worried about dying, they'd go back to religion. So like King Sejong was very famous for these harsh measures against Buddhism early in life. But later in life, he sponsored a number of Buddhist projects. He's particularly famous for, after he invented Hangul and set it into a printing format, he made most use of his printing press to print Buddhist texts to distribute to the common people in a language they could read. Also in 1550 to 65, there was a brief respite in oppressive policies under the influence of the Dowager Queen, who was pro-Buddhist. When she died, however, there was this extreme revival in oppressive policies, and it's from the Chosun period that you get terms that you hear a lot in Buddhism, like Sanjung, like in the title of the diary that I'm translating. Sanjung is literally in the mountains or to the mountains, because since Buddhists were no longer allowed to practice in cities and Buddhist temples were no longer allowed to exist in cities, everyone had to relocate to the mountains. You get things like, I guess, Sanjung is a good way to leave it. Also during this period, as a further example of the divide between public and private practice, you have a lot of Confucian literati staying in residence at monasteries while they study for the civil exams. And a lot of them later in life going back to these monasteries, traveling around, carrying out a kind of half secular, half religious pilgrimage route. And from that, you get the tradition of these journals that the journal I translated is a continuation of. Okay, then we move on to end of Chosun and modern Korean Buddhism. So, the end of Chosun, Buddhism is banished to the mountains, things aren't going well, and then the Konghwa Treaty happens, and Japanese are allowed into Korea. And in Japan, Buddhism had been having some issues of its own. During the Meiji period, early Meiji, Buddhism was kind of on the outs with the government because they thought it was outdated and not very modern. So within 2 decades or so, Japanese Buddhism reinvented itself to prove that it was this force for rationality and that it was compatible with modernity, in contrast to what they painted as the irrationality of this theistic new Christian faith. And they set themselves up as this super nationalistic force that would do anything to help the new colonizing government. So with the Konghwa Treaty, one of the first things that happened is when the Japanese came into Busan, they set up a Buddhist temple there right away. And the Japanese Buddhist missionaries set about doing really nice things for Korean Buddhists. They successfully lifted the ban. This Nichiren monk named Sano Zanre lobbied successfully to repeal the ban forbidding Buddhist monks from entering the cities. So that was a huge deal for Korean Buddhists. They also established missionary schools. This most famous one is the Buddhist Study Society, Purgyo Yongguhe, established in 1906. And they attempted to reintroduce a centralized structure to temple management in order to create a unified Korean Buddhist order. That was ultimately unsuccessful, but it was a nice effort. So Buddhism under colonial rule is kind of a mixed bag. After all these nice things that they did, in 1911, Japanese authorities issued something called the Temple Law, placing all temples and their properties under the supervision of the Governor General and controlling the appointment of abbots. So basically, they turned all these friendly gestures into a stranglehold on Korean Buddhism. So as a result of this, you've got this division in attitude towards colonial power among Korean Buddhists. You can basically break it up into 4 major attitudes. You've got the traditionalists, who were celibate and independent of the Japanese. This was by far the minority group. You have pro-Japanese priests and abbots of main temples who are not celibate, and that was a large majority. Keep in mind, Korean Buddhism is traditionally a celibate order. This idea of non-celibacy was a modern manifestation of Buddhism brought in from Japan. You have, thirdly, the progressive reformers, famous figures like Han Yong-un and Manhe, who were among the signers of the Declaration of Independence. Anyone who's into Korean literature will know Han Yong-un. He's very famous for his poetry and stories. My Lover's Silence is very well known. The progressive reformers tended to be younger monks who advocated the modernization of the monastic system and were actually for marriage for the most part. They were inspired by Japanese Buddhism, but for the most part they were strongly nationalistic. And lastly, you have lay Buddhists like Inung-hwa, who were mostly just ambivalent. They didn't really know what was going on, didn't really care. So modern Korean Buddhist movements after liberation and all that kind of stuff are primarily 3. You have the founding of Won Buddhism by Pak Chongbin, who's also known as Seok-taesan. He lived 1891 to 1943. His is a kind of strange story. He never trained in a monastery. He had a mystical experience in 1916 that he later referenced as an enlightenment, despite the fact that it was inspired by the I Ching and Confucian speculation, rather than Buddhism. So characteristics of Won Buddhism is that it's radically secular. They tend to mistrust celibate clergy. They gave women an important role, which was a nice change. It was essentially a fusion of various Buddhist ideas and practices with a Confucian veneer of family values, the fourfold beneficence, and so on, and Christian rituals. They congregated on Sundays. They had a threefold path of training: cultivation, which is kind of a goal-oriented meditation; investigation into Buddhist principles such as cause and effect, being and non-being, the mutual interdependence of all things; and mindful choice in relation to ethical matters. Secondly, you have the rebirth of the Bhikkhuni order, and that's the nuns movement in Korea. There's some evidence that female monasteries continued during the Chosun period, but that's still being researched. A lot more research has to be done into that. During the 20th century, it definitely had a resurgence. The principal figures are Myori Kokwe, 1887 to 1974. She was a leading nun of the 20th century, and she was also a student of Mangong, who was one of these progressive monks that I talked about. And probably also most famous is Kim Il-ryok, 1896 to 1971, who's probably more infamous than famous. She was a prominent modern nun and did a lot to attract women to Buddhism. But she was most well known for writing about her turbulent life as one of these new women in modern Korea. She wrote a lot about her former lovers. She'd been married 3 times. She'd had a child outside of marriage. So she's starting to be respected a little more now, but I'm not actually sure how much of a positive impact she had on the public perception of the Bhikkhuni order in the past 50-some years. And probably most importantly, the third modern Korean Buddhist movement that you get is the Choge order, the Choge-tong. They were officially established in 1962, but they had much earlier antecedents. They usually trace their origins to the first Sun monks in Korea, so they trace themselves to Chinul and the patriarchal lineage that he came from. So the name Choge first resurfaced in 1941 to designate this attempt to create an overarching organization for Korean Buddhism. That was called the Chosun Bulgyo Choge-tong. The legacy of colonialism was a big issue for the Choge order when they got started. There was this stigma of collaboration that tended to fall primarily on married monks, because married monks were following this imposed modern Japanese Buddhist order. People did draw a distinction, however, between married monks and celibate monks. There were around 7,000 monks at the time in the 1940s, and only about 600 of them were thought to be celibate. So you had during the 1940s something called Cheonghwa-undong, the purification drives. They gained momentum, particularly after the Korean War, because President Lee Sung-man endorsed the celibate monks over the married monks. He issued a proclamation that said all married monks had to leave the monasteries. People weren't too into that, though. Most of the married monks wouldn't leave, so you had literally physical fighting in the temples. And celibate monks, because there weren't as many of them at the time as married or uncelibate monks, started recruiting thugs off the street into the orders. So you had literally like a mafia war going on in Buddhist temples. I don't know what happened to all those thugs after the fighting. And then 1961, you get the assumption of power by Pak Chung-hee and the launching of the new unified Choge order, Taean-Bulgyo Choge-tong, in 1962. Then So officially, this 1962 Unified Order was supposed to be a synthesis of the married and unmarried monks, but conflicts continued. So in 1970, married monks broke off completely into an order of their own, and they kind of continue there to this day. Their numbers are dwindling, ironically. So Chogyetong, the celibate order, is currently the representative face of Korean Buddhism. There's over 2,500 temples, 10,000 monks, that's about equally nuns and monks, and around 3,000 novices. So they're doing pretty well for themselves. Okay, now we get into my actual work. So I mentioned this tradition of travel journals. It dates back probably to as early as the Samguk-shide Silla period, but really picks up steam during the Chosun period. It's still a pretty sparsely documented history. The books are around, but people haven't done much collective analysis of them. However, right now they're being increasingly used by scholars as primary source material for otherwise little documented periods of Buddhist history and periods of personal and national crisis. So especially like Chosun period, when the temples have been banished to the mountains and there's not much written history. They're also a reflection of how private intersections between this officially ostracized Buddhist practice and officially sanctioned Confucian study were often less drastically separated than it would seem from just reading the history. Hyun-sik, the monk who wrote this diary, lived from 1895 to 1962. He was educated at Yonsei University and at Meiji University in philosophy. He was actually a Christian earlier in life and only entered the Buddhist order 1930 something, mid-30s I think. So he was atypically old at the time. Perhaps reflecting this unconventional position, he has a pretty determinedly one-of-a-kind perspective, and you kind of love him and hate him at different times, but he's definitely an individual. So I thought the best way to get to know him was kind of how he introduces himself. This is literally the first entry in the book. He wants to look into becoming a Buddhist monk. So he asks a reporter friend what he should do. His reporter friend sends him down to the Seonagwon in Andong. So that's in Seoul. People should know where that is. It's still around, by the way. And when he gets there, he's got to kill some time because he's waiting for the Chuji, the superintendent, I guess, of the Seonagwon, to come back to the temple. And so he, crosses the yard and runs into Han Yong-won, who I mentioned. He was one of the signers of the independence, the Declaration of Independence. He's a big deal. I would be fazed if I was running into someone who was that big a deal. But this guy, I'm not going to read the Korean because I think it'll take too long if I do the Korean for all of this. So the excerpt is, as we waited for the abbot, our conversation came around to the fundamental issues of life and being. And at some point it was said that all humanity lives without purpose, to which I responded, why do you say that? I have a very clear purpose. And what is your purpose? I live to understand what the purpose of life is. I read this and I thought, this guy's conceited. He is full of himself. And this doesn't really stop for the book. He kind of goes on like this for a while. But he definitely has a personality, which is why I think his journal makes a good vehicle for translation. It's both an illustration of this literary genre that's characteristic of Korean religious history, and it's a pretty unique deviation from the conventional constraints of that type mold. The latter qualification, I think, is probably a reflection of the likewise distinctive developments in the historical period he was living in. As far as deviation goes, he has this strongly individuated narrative voice and an episodic format to his writing that I feel is particularly well suited to an English-speaking Western audience that tends to be accustomed by its own literary tradition to an affinity for the episodic and the individualistic, but is also equally compelled by the mysteries of East Asian culture at large, this continuing kind of Orientalist trend, and this perceived esoteric religious tradition specifically. So I feel that by catering to the latter desire for knowledge, while offering the former element of accessibility, Hyunchik offers the English language world an intoxicating blend of the known and unknown via translation. His individuated voice also has this humanizing quality that I found lacking in all the other journals that I read from the Chosun period. Those journals tend to be, the weather today was cold. I think the weather today, or the weather tomorrow, is going to be warmer. I took a nap today. I'm gonna eat something later. It's just, there's not much personality in them. You know, he's personalized to the extreme, like sometimes too much. He has this awkward habit of talking about his bowel movements, often. And I think in humanizing himself as an author, he also humanizes the Buddhist clergy that he was a part of, and I feel that he humanizes the Korean nation and its history at large during one of the most critical junctures, many of the most critical junctures of its recent history. I think that's probably, in my experience, the biggest issue with attracting people to Korean studies is that Korea doesn't seem personalized as a country to a lot of people. People have faces for Vietnam, they have faces for Japan or China, but there aren't any faces that people can grab onto for Korean history. So I think, as much as I was kind of on the board about it to begin with, because I was thinking, you know, if you're going to translate something, you should translate something that's really characteristically Korean. But you know, you also have to make sure that it speaks to people and speaks to them in a way they can understand. So that is my argument for translating. Okay, so the journal timeline is 1931 to 1965. The historical background during this period, just so we're all up to speed. Oh, and by the way, this is only narrating his life after he enters the Buddhist order, so it doesn't bother with anything beforehand. So to get us all up to speed on what's going on during this 30-some year period, you have the final decade of the Japanese occupation of Korea. You've got the post-war division of Korea, the period of U.S. military government in Korea. You have the kind of the Pacific theater of the Second World War. I mean, it wasn't really in Korea, but you know, it was nearby. You've got the Korean War. And then the aftermath of the Korean War, you have this struggle for national reconstruction and a political power struggle that plays out in the journal in two ways, both in the national power struggle that you see in the ascendance of Pak Chung-hee in 61, and in the Buddhist community in the internal conflicts of the Choge order that I outlined briefly. Okay, so his engagement with his historical background, I think is another argument for why his is a pretty humanized account that's worth translating. He generally confines his historical, political, social, whatever considerations to these pretty cursory speculations. For the most part, he's concerned with his everyday life, with the goings-on in the monasteries, with his bowel movements, with what he's reading. But for me, I found that this casual reference system served as a humanizing reminder of the continuation of everyday life and personal concerns in the face of what were literally world-changing events. It reminded me of, after reading this, I felt like there should be more oral history where, you know, these big events in Korea are concerned. So I called up all my grandmother's brothers and sisters, my grandfather's brothers and sisters, and asked them, hey, you know, if it's not too painful, can you tell me something about the occupation period or the war period? And all of them were like, I'm like, oh, it's too painful. They're like, no, I just don't really remember anything. I don't remember much going on. So it kind of had that to me a little bit. Like, things were going on, but life is always your foremost concern. There is, however, a slow sense of changes in his global perspective, mixed with, you know, these little reminders about the specific time frame he's living in. For example, he only ever refers to Korea as Chosun. And, you know, until the 60s and the 70s, I think most Koreans did the same. And I think as far as the sense of change goes, you see it the most in this kind of internationalized perspective. You can definitely see the effect of, you know, the Kangwa Treaty and Korea being opened to the outside world in the way, you know, he interacts with foreigners or foreign ideas or, you know, foreign history for that matter. Okay, so we've got a few examples of these kind of cursory references to the history that was going on. So the first one is going to Pongcheon, Manchuria. So he says, because I wanted to see a major Chinese monastery at least once, in the spring of 1934, I boarded a train bound for Pongcheon at the Chichisa station. On the night of the third day, I arrived at Kwanumsa in Pongcheon and took up the road to China. Because it was wartime, I was told that I could not go at all, so I sought out the largest temple downtown, Cheonsa, and requested admission for the summer season. As might have been expected due to the political situation, however, the military authority in charge had no sympathy for my request and denied my position. And so against my will, I turned back and went to Poktonam in Seongni Mountain. I found this particularly interesting because he had the mobility to go all the way to Manchuria during the colonial period. I was not aware at the time that I read this that such movement was still possible during the colonial period. But he mentions a few times even later, like cousins of his who spent 10-some years, moved to China during the colonial period and spent 10-some years there just to kind of get out of this Japanese hold on Korea. Secondly, you have dreaming of becoming a monk. So one day, as I was preparing breakfast, a boy wearing a student's cap came into the kitchen and introduced himself. Let me finish this and then we're done. Why do you want to become a monk? Because right now, although all Chosun people live in miserable conditions, out of those, the most wretched is that of the poor country people. Though there are some cases where at least these poor rustics' bodies are healthy and they can earn a livelihood and eat, the number of those who cannot work because of serious illness are too many to count. If I become a monk, I will understand the way and carry it and heal those people's illnesses. What you say is truly admirable. However, as I see it, you carry within yourself an illness more serious than that of the people. Have you not thought on how to cure that illness? And I think it got cut off here, but yeah, the boy sat without answer before the fire, and after some time he left. By the way, he never encourages anyone to become a monk. Every time someone comes to him, he just shoots them down, hardcore. And I don't have time to get to everything else, so thank you. And if anyone wants to read further excerpts, I have a ton of them printed out here.
Okay, please ask questions if you have.
I'm a little bit confused about the Chogi order and the Sun Buddhism, and I know Korea is famous for Sun, but how do you distinguish, or are they really the same?
Chogi order is Sun Buddhism. Sorry for not clarifying that. Yeah, this during the Chosun period, since everything else pretty much got cut out, Sun was the only line of Buddhism that existed within Korea. So Chogi was basically an attempt to not so much unify Sun and other orders, but unify these modern Sun orders that were imported from Japan versus the more traditional celibate Sun orders that had existed in Korea up to that point.
And so now we have the celibate and the non-celibate, and these are both sun, but how would you differentiate the order?
They're both sun. Choge is the celibate order at this point. The non-celibate, I don't even know how many they are. They're really, really dwindling. So this marriage thing, it's not working for them too well. They're not producing any Buddhist babies. Yeah, the Choge is it's just celibate Sun Buddhism. Sorry, it's a confusing history. Sorry.
Yes.
Inga, I know that your grant ends in December, and so I'm wondering, what will be the culmination of your research? What will you do now? How will you finish?
I'm working on editing the final draft of the translation with Professor Chonsu in the philosophy department at Sorde. And right now we're basically putting in footnotes and annotations, that kind of thing, and working on an introduction. And then hopefully in 3 or 4 weeks or so, we'll be able to send it out to publishers and try to get that taken care of by, I don't know, February, something like that. Oh my God.
And how did you find this monk and his journal?
I made my Fulbright proposal first for a book called the Sanjung-ilgi that I found at the UChicago libraries, and that's a Chosun era travel journal. And then when I came here, I wanted to work with Chonsu, so I called her and she asked what I was working with. And I said the Sanjung-ilgi. So I show up at her office and she pulls out Sanjung-ilgi instead, because apparently my pronunciation is not so good over the phone. So I just figured I'd take it home and read it for kicks, and I ended up thinking it was a lot more engaging and worth translating than Chosun, the Chosun journal that I was reading, which is kind of a struggle because Chosun is a really underdeveloped area of study in Korean Buddhism, and it's really worth looking into. But at this point in my studies, my Chinese isn't really good enough to do full credit to a manuscript like that. Like, I have to read the Hangul translation. I just can't understand all the Hanja on my own. So it's just literally not within my powers to do something like that right now. Yes.
Why did you title the project or this presentation Moving Towards?
It's from a poem that he has partway through the book where he talks about, how a lot of monks, he's asked to be a master at a monastery at some point. And he tries it for a few months and then he says, I had to leave because, for some monks, maybe being in one place all the time is good for them. But for me, I'm most at home in my heart when I'm moving around all the time.
Where's the original text at? Is there an original still?
Yeah, actually, I've been...
Do you have images perhaps? Or?
No, I don't have images. It's still at Sonhagwon in Andong, in Seoul. I've been talking to the woman who put together this first publication of it. She just grabbed all these scattered pages and notes that he had when he died and looked through them and kind of put together a manuscript. It's really great work on her part, and she did a great job of editing and kind of getting rid of the boring stuff, I guess. I've looked at it. I don't have any images. I'm sorry.